Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to risk, COVID, resilience, business continuity, emergency management, crisis management, anything relatable to those topics and anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. A couple of quick announcements. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick there, really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. And the last conference for me anyway, this year, Continuity and Resilience Today, running November 30th to December 2nd, which is now virtual. I will be presenting there, and I'm also going to be manning the media desk with a colleague, Grayson Crockett. We're going to meet next week and figure out exactly how we're going to do that. You can tell by the background change, it's that time again for This Week in Business Continuity with James Green. James, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Alex. Happy Friday. We're recording this a Friday morning, and I think this is the fourth of fifth days I've talked to you this week. So It's a lot of Alex and James. I love it.
And for those that might not know, this week was the big CI World Virtual Conference 2021. James was in some of the sessions I was. We were both presenting. We were both part of running into Q&A sessions all over the place. So we kept crossing paths quite a bit this week.
Yes, we did.
Even trying to record this on Tuesday, but it was my turn for technical issues. So hence today. So let's jump in on BCI World because I mentioned it. How did it go for you? What'd you think?
You and I were chatting about this with a group last week, and I think I'm honestly starting to feel a little virtual conference fatigue. Part of that was my fault. I was speaking and attending BCI World this week. I was also a delegate to a UN conference this week at the exact same time, bouncing back and forth, trying to grab as much information as I could. And I feel I got a little lost this week. I think maybe just information overload and trying to bounce from a conference that's focused on business continuity globally to a conference that's focused on resilience in the Caribbean. And I think I have some virtual fatigue. I need to see some people in person. But outside of that, the conference went well. BCI World. I think we're I wrote an article that I keep talking about a year and a half ago, a profession at a crossroads. Yeah. And the reason I bring that up is not to promote myself, but I really felt like this conference, we're at that crossroads. Like I've never felt so much consternation or strategic discussion. Usually everyone you attend a trade organizations based conference, there's a lot of tactical sessions. There's a lot of how-to sessions. Yeah. I felt the most I've ever felt this week where people were presenting, and more importantly, people in the Q&A and in the networking sessions and discussions, like, where are we going? And that's kind of one takeaway that I'm carrying right now, thinking about is I've never felt so many people in our profession just really asking, what are we doing? Where are we going?
Yeah, I noticed that theme come up quite a bit, especially during the Q&As. Sometimes someone would present on a specific topic, but then you get to the Q&A and somehow it always reverted to, how do we show our value? What do we do? Not how do we do a specific item, but how do we change people's minds on what we do? How do we move this industry forward? Yeah, and I found that it happened in the panel and networking sessions I was a part of. Yep. And it came up during the Q&A session for my presentation as well. So I knew it, regardless of what you're talking about, to your point, that's exactly where we are now, is where are we going? What are we doing? We're at that crossroads, I think, and it certainly made itself known by a lot of people.
Yeah, I think next year is going to be an interesting year on the conference circuit and for our profession, because people really are at that point of where are we going? And I don't think I don't think there's a lot of great answers. I did love, again, you and I were in the discussion, so of course I loved it. But we were talking about what is resilience. And that was kind of something I was very passionate about and popped off about at BCI. I don't want to define resilience because your organization of resilience, your definitions excuse me, I'll get there at some point. Your organization's definition of resilience is completely different than mine and completely irrelevant. What you need to do to help an organization become resilient is going to be different than what I need to do. And I really want us to get away from some terminology definitions because I don't think it matters. And I was trying to explain this to my kids yesterday, and they said, well, why are you so getting spun up about a definition? And the analogy I came up with is, if I asked you to define what is rich, how do you define rich? You are going to define that very different than I am, very different than my son who sees $20 and is like, wow, this is the most money in the world. But the point is, it doesn't matter. Your definition of rich means nothing for what I'm trying to accomplish for my family. And my definition of resilience really means nothing for what you're trying to do with the organizations you work with. I think there's some commonalities, but I hope as a profession, we stop going way into the weeds of defining resilience.
Yeah, that was, and I think I mentioned it yesterday in that Q&A session with you, is for the longest time, I've been saying that, hey, we need a clear definition of understanding it. And I said it. When you turned around in your presentation, you said, my definition doesn't matter. How the organization defines resilience is what I have to kind of adapt and adopt my practice to, and then we move forward from there. And it was an eye-opening moment for me because after all this time saying, hey, there is no clear definition of resilience, it's no wonder people are confused. And I thought, well, I'm not working with all these people and all these organizations. I'm only working with a couple or one or whatever the case may be. And it's their definition that matters, not mine or an industry's or somebody else's. So it was kind of an eye-opening moment for me, and a few other people kind of commented on that as well. The interesting thing is the last session we had yesterday with Mark Hoffman and Sarah Garrington, the topic came up about terminology. And for the most part, industry terminology needs to be standardized. But yes, the talk of standardizing a definition for resilience didn't come up. And I thought that was interesting. And that's why your comment about it and the definition was quite an eye-opening moment for me. I thought that was really good. That was one of the biggest takeaways I took from your session, but also from BCI. It's like, yeah.
And in full disclosure, I kind of stumbled on my new philosophy when I was trying to define resilience for my presentation. And you and I had spoken about that earlier. And that's when I was like, well, why am I trying to define this for everyone? It doesn't matter. And that's when I kind of went in a completely different direction.
Yeah. You mentioned too, with the virtual fatigue, but granted, you were on two conferences at the same time. That probably didn't help. Any thoughts on what you think might happen next year with the conference circuit? Because I know those that are already planning for the spring are showing themselves to be in person, again, but who knows what might happen. However, I noticed in the last session again with Sarah and Mark, we had a gentleman named Sam. And Sam, if you're watching, hello. I unfortunately can't remember your last name. My apologies. He was in Australia, and he said that if BCI World wasn't virtual, he wouldn't be able to attend. And I know we had people in Africa attending, other Asian countries, and throughout Europe. In fact, one of the sessions, Izzy, I hope I'm remembering Izzy's name right. She only went by one name, Izzy. And she was a few hours ahead of the UK. So she was attending a session at midnight, 1 a.m. So I thought, wow, what's going to happen next year if they go in person? All these people from around the globe may not be attending. So are we going to have an in-person, a virtual, or some sort of a hybrid model?
I think the more sophisticated conference organizers are going to try to stay hybrid because they recognize, let's take BCI World as an example. This was my third BCI World. The last two were virtual. The first one, I was accepted as a speaker. It was in London, but I was also paid by my employer to go there. And that only worked because my company ended up being a vendor sponsor at BCI World. If I was a practitioner and you were my boss and I said, hey, Alex, awesome news, I got accepted to speak at BCI World. And you're like, that's amazing. Good job, James. By the way, I need $9,000 to go. You're going to laugh at me. Same thing if I said, I want to attend this truly global conference, I need $9,000 to go. You're like, well, your budget this year is $500. So I think what we're going to see, I think the US-based spring conferences in not just in risk, but there's a spring season and a fall season for any type of trade conference in the US. I think the US ones are going to really push in-person conferences because their sponsors are starting to get upset. But you either have to make a decision, that global audience that we had, we're going to give away. And most companies don't readily give up customers. I think what's really going to happen, you're going to see a kind of hybrid mishmash. And I think the first year it's going to be messy until companies and organizations figure out how do you really interact in a hybrid model. There's a lot that you lose. So again, the United Nations conference that I was a part of this week, we were all supposed to be in Jamaica, which is amazing. Instead, I was in my office again. The delegates and speakers who were already in Jamaica, people who live there, were live. The rest of us were virtual. And I really felt like it kind of broke off into all the virtual people were talking as attendees. How do you interact with someone who's live? And I think if an organization figures that out, they will, they're going to see attendance. But yeah, I think they're going to push forward with the hybrid model. And I think it's going to be messy the first year. What are your thoughts?
I agree with you. I know a lot of people, because we've touched on this before, you miss out on the face-to-face, even just walking down the hallway. If we see each other or you were speaking, it's like, hey, I really enjoyed your presentation. The spur of the moment, off the cuff conversations that can happen, and you kind of miss out on those. But I also found that on the virtual side, with the Q&As and the network sessions, there were a lot of good comments and interactions between people. And you could see that people were from around the globe that you wouldn't get in person. So I found it rather interesting that there were pros and cons on both sides. It will be interesting to see what happens next year, who is to go in person and who will be virtual, or if a hybrid model will come out. And I understand the point from vendors, but we've talked about this too. Vendors are now finding new ways to do what they were doing anyway.
Yep.
And for some of them, they may not even bother with conferences anymore because they're still getting their message out to wider audiences by doing their own webinars or training sessions or whatever they may be, by being online. So I'm not sure if it's the big companies who are pushing for in-person or the smaller ones that are pushing, trying to get their name out there. So it will be rather messy to see how things fall over the next year or so, especially for these big ones that have been changed. But at the same time, maybe this going virtual will help some of the smaller conferences build a bigger audience.
Yeah, certainly. If you're a small company, let's look at what was the last conference we were in person, DRJ fall 2019.
Yeah, I think so.
And the company I worked for at the time, SAI Global, was the platinum, super duper, tinfoil. I don't know what the top tier status was. We had that top tier status. we had 14 people, at the JW Marriott for 5-6 days. So you have to look at what we spent to do that, the sponsorship alone, but then 14 people at a high-end resort for a week, plus airfare, plus everything. The costs are very high. And if you're a big organization, it's probably worth it. But to your point, if you and I started a startup tomorrow, we could never spend that kind of money to be a big, Mac Daddy sponsor at a conference, but a virtual one, we certainly could, get a much higher ROI for what's much smaller dollar amount. So I think it's going to be interesting to see which conference organizers thread that needle between in-person and virtual and satisfying sponsors and attendees. I think one thing that I have seen over the last 2 years where the Q&As are most effective is when they're smaller. So you and I have presented at virtual conferences all around the world for 2 years. When I get into a Q&A session afterwards and there's 50 people, there's very little interaction. But when we had my BCI session last night, there was only 5 people in the Q&A. And at first I was disappointed. I was like, what the heck? This is a tiny group, honestly. But then I got excited because all 5 people were really not just talking to each other, but with each other. And we had a very meaningful conversation, and we got to meet some people I hadn't met before. And I thought there was some really thought-provoking Q&A. So I think maybe that's one thing I'd like to see some conference organizers do going forward. Maybe make those smaller rooms, those smaller events, and I think they're going to be more meaningful.
Yeah, I discovered that too, even with my own. It was a small group as well. I can't remember the number, but not different than yours, like 7 or 8 maybe at the most. But I did find that those 8 people were all engaged and were all talking with each other. And I was answering questions, but then I got into it. It's like, no, it's not my Q&A.
Yeah.
It's a small group here, and we're all talking together, all on the same level, all teaching each other things, asking each other things. And I kind of preferred that rather than having a group of 50 that would appear, as you say. I found it much more engaging. And before I knew it, it's like, well, our time's up, and it was kind of disappointing that, we only had the 10, 15 minutes or whatever it is we're given for Q&A. But I enjoyed that more than talking with a larger group. I found it much more interesting.
Absolutely.
On that note, we've come to the end of it. Well, actually, before I end the session, I should say I want to thank Sergio and all his team at BCI. We had a great time. You kept us on time, and hopefully we made it look seamless, because it's not easy to do. So I want to thank Sergio and all his team at BCI for bringing all that together.
Absolutely.
And all the speakers and presenters and all the people we got to meet and talk to. It was fantastic. And I think James would probably agree with me on that one too.
Absolutely.
On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to This Week in Business Continuity. It's our talk with James Green today. James, our next topic, we're going to talk about risk management. I'm going to let you take the lead on where this came from and why we're going to talk about it today.
Absolutely. So, Alex, we got our first ever request for a topic for our show. So Luke Bird, who many people know is a member of the global BCI board of directors, asked us to talk about business continuity and enterprise risk management, business continuity and risk management. He wrote a post in LinkedIn, which I recommend everyone take a look at. I've got some notes here. The title was Resilience, What's Risk Got to Do with It? And one of the quotes he wrote was, the business continuity professional community could arguably benefit from understanding the wider context of enterprise risk management, regardless of their sector. He asked for my thoughts. He asked for your thoughts. He asked if we would talk about it. And Luke, we're going to talk about this for the next 3.5 hours. So I hope you stay stay to the end. It was kind of funny, Alex, because my presentation at DRJ 3 weeks ago had the title Friend or Foe, Business Continuity, and Enterprise Risk Management. So I feel like I was being set up on all of that. And most of my presentation, if you watched it, I had a lot of jokes about prickly pear margaritas and Star Trek to try to liven it up. But it is a topic that I'm familiar with and passionate about because of my experience. I was the head of business continuity for a financial services based company in the United States. We set up an enterprise risk office. So enterprise risk management and business continuity were peers, reported to the risk officer. We then added vendor risk management and a lot of other things. So I got to see, firsthand, here's why this is happening. Here's what's happening. Here's where it goes right. And also here's where it goes wrong. So I was just making some notes on that of the things I like and the things I don't like. Before I jump into the deep end of the pool, I'd love to get some of your high level thoughts on business continuity and ERM, business continuity and risk management.
Well, one of the first things that caught my attention in the LinkedIn post and some of the comments that were coming back is it reminded me a few years ago, there was a report that came from BC Management with Cheyenne Marling, where some of the results of a survey, a lot of people were happy to see that business continuity was coming out of IT or coming out of finance or some of these other groups and starting to appear under a risk management umbrella of some sort, whatever it was called, but a risk management umbrella. And I found that now people are upset about that. And I think it's because maybe they don't understand their part in risk management, or they feel as though they're being taken over by risk management. And that could be because risk management, there's risk in everything.
Yes.
So I think people have different perceptions of what risk management is. I mean, getting out of bed in the morning is risk. It can be a risk. I know that's a silly example, but risk is inherent in our life, in daily life, our communities, our homes, everything. And I think a lot of people were upset when business continuity, at first it seemed great. Yeah, we're coming out of that. But all of a sudden they ended up under risk management and they're saying, well, no, we're getting swallowed up. And that was the big thing that caught me right off the bat when I started reading people's responses to Luke's post.
Yeah, I think the angriest I made an audience this year was during a webinar when I was talking about this topic, and someone said business continuity is not risk management and they should always be separate. And the audience was very angry with some of the things I was talking about. But here's some things I'm seeing of why business continuity and ERM need to work together. And a lot of the things have nothing to do with either vertical in and of itself. But the first thing to me is cybersecurity. If you talk to any executive today, what's your biggest concern? What do you think your biggest risk is? I would think 9 out of 10 executives are going to say cybersecurity. And to me, it's a great example because cyber is an enterprise risk, right? Because if all of your employees suddenly lose access to their computers, does that infect the entire enterprise? Yes. Is that also a business continuity event? Yes. And I'm really, concerned about the future of our industry because so much time and attention is being focused at the top on cybersecurity that I think it threatens to swallow all of risk and just everything becomes cyber. And if BC and ERM aren't working together to show executives that there's other aspects of cybersecurity that fall into BC and ERM, I think you're going to have these organizations become so myopic on the technical side of cybersecurity that all the time and attention and money will go there. And then when some other type of enterprise risk or business continuity event happen, it's just going to blow them away because they haven't even thought about it. What are you have some thoughts on the cyber aspect of all of this?
Well, yeah. Years ago, I used to work in a group called Security and Business Continuity. So I sat beside the security guys, and we talked a lot, and I learned a lot from those guys, which was fantastic. A lot of people were always focused on the information security, which is basically what it was called back then. Cyber, that word really hadn't hit mainstream back then. So everyone was worried about the technical side and, what do we do when our systems are corrupted and things like that, and looking at it from them. But I was standing up, but business continuity, what are the business doing then if they can't get to their data?
Correct.
Or they find that they've lost 3 days of data or worse. What happens then? What are they doing? And a lot of people didn't want to address that because they thought that, IT will fix it. And I think sometimes that there is that thought that IT knows, IT will fix it, because IT is so dominant in our lives, in our communities, even at home. You can have Alexa turn on your lights for you. There's so much technology in our lives, then technology will be our answer, regardless of what happens. And that's a false perception. You can't do that. Business continuity has to be involved when there's a cyber incident, because you can't have half, if you've got, for argument's sake, half IT people, half non-IT people, you can't have half your organization just sitting there. Something's got to happen. What about all your external partners that are expecting files or deliveries or wanting to place orders? Where's all those activities occurring? What's happening there? How are you discovering if IT is able to bring something back up? How are you identifying what you've lost? What was in transit that's only halfway been submitted? What's been corrupted? IT can tell you all the pretty green lights are on their servers and the mainframe is all working tickety-boo, but they're not looking at the data. And everybody else on the other side seems to think, well, technology will take care of it. So there's that. But I also wanted to bring forward that in risk management and project management is a proactive approach. And for the longest time, business continuity is always seen as a response.
Correct.
To something. But risk management in project management is proactive. What could impact the implementation date? Availability, resources, when we actually flip the switch, if there's an issue, all these different things as you go through a project, and you come up with mitigation plans. Okay, here's how we hopefully prevent this risk from ever occurring. Here's who's responsible for it. You document it, you implement it. Sometimes it's a change record or whatever the case may be. And you have all that captured so that as you move along, you're identifying risks, but you're able to get over them, but you're still captured on how to deal with it if something does occur. And that approach doesn't seem to catch on with a lot of people outside of project management. And I had this in slides on my presentation too, where the first column I had was listing, traditional resilience or business continuity was all response focused. Right. Incident management, emergency management, business continuity management, crisis management, and only things that happen after the fact. But we have to change that focus because, like project management, it has to be proactive. And everybody should be able to identify risks. Where we could be in the same organization, but we're going to face different risks. I'm in finance, you're in marketing. I'm not going to experience the same things you are. How do we address that? How do we look at that? And that's probably a little bit simplified, but that was some of my initial thoughts on risk management and trying to change that response focus to proactive and preparedness, because that would help build, other strategies and ideas to deal when things come along. And that's, if you're not proficient in risk management, project management, you can't become a project manager. You
Right.
have to know that, which I find rather interesting, because in business continuity, over the years, even though we're talking about risk management, that risk assessment gets mentioned less and less and less now, I've been finding.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why there was such consternation at BCI World, because our whole world, our profession has turned upside down. Most organizations, they do a BIA of quantitative and qualitative known risk. They write a business continuity plan around known events. They do an exercise around the most likely event. And to your point, those are all response and react activities, and those are important. But I think people are realizing over the last 2 years that can't be the end game, because then what happens when that next bump in the night comes? What happens when there's a pandemic? What happens when there's riots or something no one thought about? Those organizations weren't prepared. Those people in our profession weren't prepared for that as all. And I think that's where, like you said, that project management, that agility, that risk management, to me, that's where resilience, my definition of resilience is we are able to manage through any event, known and unknown.
Yeah, and I think at one point, a lot of us, for risk management and business continuity, if you think of the Ishikawa diagram, fishbone diagram, I think is most people know it as, your main event and a couple of things branch off of it. It looks
Yes.
like a fishbone diagram. And that it perfectly describes what you just said, the basic scenario, known scenarios. But then you start branching off of some of these, smaller bones, off a flood. Well, the flood doesn't have to occur to my building for me to be impacted. But my plan only addresses if the flood impacts my building. Well, now you have to start going beyond that. What if it impacts my community and half my staff live on the other side of the river that in an area that just flooded? Now what? You have to start going beyond that. And I think that's what a lot of people now are starting to do. For the longest time, we've always been talking about, I always use the term people, places, and things, PPT. With continuity planning, the three key areas, if something happens, you have a plan to deal with it. Well, COVID came along, you still had your people, you still had your places, and you still had your things. So that basic fish bone diagram, you can't just focus on those main bones anymore and the main items. You've got to see beyond now and start really thinking of, okay, what can impact my people? And it's not just fire, flood, tornado, hurricane, whatever, the basics. You've got to see beyond that and know that it doesn't have to occur in your backyard for you to be impacted. Look at the supply chain issues that we're having around the globe, and the ship in the Suez Canal, when it hit the side, and all that was there to dig it out was, I think eventually a tugboat and one backhoe.
Yep.
From pictures we saw. Well, who would have had a plan for that? I doubt, and I've never seen anyone admit that there was a plan for that. So I think risk management and business continuity now, I think are perfectly positioned, because one was always proactive, one was responsive. Well, now they've got to work together to bring those together, the response and the preparedness. If we're prepared, if it happens, we can continue on. We've got the next step in place. So I think it's a good thing that the two are coming together, and I think they should.
Yeah, and I think, you brought up supply chain. To me, that's another great reason why these different organizations need to work together. Most business continuity professionals are a team of one, a party of one, a small team. So they have to mitigate the most likely risk. And what we've learned over the last 2 years is when you get likelihood wrong, you get it really wrong. Yeah. And supply chain is another area that you and I have talked about for a couple of months, and it's starting to become a bigger problem. There was a great article in Bloomberg this week, and I'm looking at it over here. Supply chain crisis risks taking the global economy down with it. Now, Bloomberg is not a publication that usually deals in hyperbole with its titles. But that article was saying this could wreck everything. You and I have talked about this on the micro level. I finally got my dishwasher, right? Inconvenience, but that was, I was without a dishwasher for 6-7 weeks. As a family, so what? But if I was a restaurant, that's a problem. If I lose a key server in a data center and I can't replace it for weeks, that's a problem. To me, supply chain is another great intersection of ERM and business continuity. And if you look at it just from either lens, you're going to get stuck. And we're seeing companies get in real trouble right now. And I think you're going to see now the retail sector starting to freak out because, Black Friday in the United States, holiday shopping is where most retailers, a lot of retailers make their money for the year in the next 45, 60 days. And if you can't deliver those items within that time, either customers are going to cancel orders or more likelihood, a lot of companies, the way they set up their accounting, they can't recognize that revenue until the item ships. You're going to see a lot of companies, I think, have very surprising fourth quarter financials because supply chain issues that wreck the entire organization. So to me, that's an enterprise risk management issue. That's also a business continuity issue.
Yeah, and just to continue on what you were saying, last week or the week before, I read an article that said some of the toy providers, shall we say, and shops that are out there are starting to pivot from the technology type of gifts because of the shortages with chips and factories and just the product itself, are now switching to more traditional type of toys. A lot of stuffies, or as my nieces call them, stuffed animals, and Legos and games and things like that. The more traditional stuff instead of the high-end stuff, so that they can try and still make those profits, because as you said, this is the time frame they start making their money that carries them through the rest of the year. Well, all these companies are coming out, hopefully, of COVID lockdowns and shutdowns and add supply chain onto that, and they've got to pivot away from some of this stuff if they're going to survive, and that's what some of them are doing right now.
Yeah, and if you as an organization, if you are fundamentally changing your business model, enterprise risk needs to be involved, because now the enterprise risk change. And as you and I have been talking about for a year and a half now, if the business is changing, business continuity needs to change. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of companies struggle with. Their business continuity plan was, we'll temporarily, everyone will work from home. And you and I have a report that we were looking at in advance of this article. Well, if everyone's already working from home, and you've brought this up several times to me, what's your business continuity plan? And what's your return to normal or return to usual if your business has completely shifted? So if we're going from digital games to board games and stuffies, everything's changing. The risk landscape changes, and all your business continuity planning has to change as well.
Yeah, you've got, you had all these technology gifts and traditional gifts, shall we say. Well, one, people are having difficulty getting to, so it's disappearing. Now you've got still the same amount of companies now going for a limited availability of stuffies and games and things like that. So now you've got different risks. Even though you're pivoting to a different product, it still may not be available because now everyone's going towards it. So you've got a different risk now. One you couldn't get, and now you may not get even if it's there, because everybody's going there.
Exactly. I think there's another area where ERM and business continuity need to work together. And you actually touched on this the last time we talked, is around brands and brand erosion. And I really feel ERM too often ignores brand erosion. And I've spoken quite openly about how business continuity too often ignores brand erosion. And the definition is a serious risk to the long-term viability of the company. That's something that BC should be looking at, ERM should be looking at. And, we spoke about last time, look at Facebook. Look at the challenges Facebook has had. That is affecting their brand. That is changing their risk landscape and their viability. And those are things that, I want to see ERM and BC professionals in on early. And those are the type of things that they should be partnering on.
Yeah. We're going to take a quick break again. I know we've got a lot more to talk about with risk, and we've got some reports we're going to talk about, but still focused on risk. It's a risk day, and today's a risk day. We're talking with James Green this week in business continuity, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. This week in business continuity with James Green. James, we've got lots more yet to say about risk. Let's move to a recent report, or survey, I should say, from FERMA, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, Federation of European Risk Management Associations. And they had a findings report where they talked with a bunch of different risk managers. Any initial thoughts on that before we start diving into a few things?
Yeah. So as you know, I like to bring you one report every time we speak. I search far and wide. I personally did not know who FERMA was, so my apologies. But yeah, they did a report with McKinsey, and the title of it was The Role of Risk Management in Corporate Resilience. And I think you and I are going to have a field day with some of these findings, because there's a big disconnect between what we're speaking about and what we're doing. So all the last year, all I've heard is strategy. But we're not there yet. Some of these results, to what extent is resilience considered in your organization's strategy? Only 16% said yes. So 84% not involved at all. And then more specifically, how much is your risk function involved in strategy discussions? Only 1 in 10 said yes. So 8 out of 10 respondents aren't considering resilience at all. And more importantly, 9 out of 10 of us, people like us, are not even in the room. And that's a tremendous problem.
Well, to take that further, there was one comment that got me when I read it. It was in one of their conclusion thoughts, because during BCI we talked about true resilience and identifying risk. You can't just look internally, you got to look at externally with your partners, your dependencies, the supply chains, which we've touched on. You've got to look at risk holistically, everything. Excuse me, everything. And yet in this report it said they do not expect that interactions with external stakeholders, including regulators, would play an important resilience strengthening role. And I thought that is so opposite of what we've been saying even here today, what we heard through presentations in BCI or DRJ before, or any other conference, periodicals that are coming out, webinars. And I thought, wow, there is a huge disconnect if this industry is saying one thing, we're saying another, and yet we're supposed to be focused on risk and resilience.
Yeah, I upset a lot of people yesterday at BCI World when I said, if your department is viewed as a cost center, you are failing when it comes to looking at relevance. But that answer exactly, if you're unwilling to work with external stakeholders, everyone we work with is an external stakeholder in our profession, literally external in terms of regulators, in terms of providers, people in your network. But inside the fence, none of the people you work with report to you. You don't report to them. Those are all stakeholders. And, like you said, that really upset me, that we're like, oh, how do we be more relevant? We have to be more proactive. We have to mitigate risk. We have to be resilient, but we're not going to talk to anyone outside of our cubicle. And those people are going to get left behind. A lot of times when I'm brought into an organization, the first thing somebody says to me is, well, I'm not really sure what James does. how are you not working with external parties? Or especially you will see it in regulated industries when I ask the person, okay, well, what groups do you belong to? What regulators do you regularly talk to? Where do you follow? And they're like, well, I don't do any of that.
Yeah.
How can you mitigate risk and do effective business continuity in a regulated environment if you know nothing about the regulated environment? So yeah, that was really interesting to me. That really jumped out. Another one, everyone here has heard me talk about the next bump in the night, and I feel resilience is looking forward, not just backwards. And here's another stat in this report that contradicted that. Which areas are most relevant for your organizational's resilience? And they had all these different items that you could check off. Only 1 in 4 said foresight capabilities. And I don't understand how, after the last 2 years that we've had, that still 3/4 of our peers don't think they're responsible for looking forward at all. I think they're going to keep getting into the same trouble that we've had the last 2 years. If you only focus backwards, if you're only doing AARs and never thinking about the future, you're going to be continually marginalized, I think, and not be relevant.
Well, you mentioned a couple of things here. First, I wanted to comment that you have to know your business, which means you've got to talk to everyone. It's part of the certification where it says you've got to go out and meet, all these different people, understand how the business operates, and know who the key players are. And then you manage the assumptions and everybody's, thoughts from there to be able to develop your strategies and your plans going forward. It's right at the very beginning of our industry. So I found that rather interesting, that so many people would not, and this report kind of alludes to that too, that people don't understand that. And the other point I wanted to comment is the after action report. You have an AAR means there was some sort of an event, right? Something happened, whatever it may be. So you have an AAR. If you don't do anything with that same event and the probability of that event is still there to reoccur. History always repeats. So you have to learn from those things. And I think a lot of people don't do that either. I mentioned it with Sarah and Mark in one of our networking sessions too. I said, I learned a long time ago, if something doesn't change, then nothing was learned.
Exactly.
You just have a lesson observed, which means you leave yourself open for that same risk to reoccur. And maybe even worse the first time. But then what will everyone have to say? Well, we learned how to do this. Nobody did anything. Nothing changed. Your policy is still the same. Your plan's still the same. The same people who needed to deal with it have the same skills. They never upgraded. We didn't make a change. So you can have all the after action reports you want. If you don't change anything and do anything with them, then you're staying on that same risk path. You're not improving. You're just experiencing the same things over and over again.
Yeah. So then why even do an AAR? Again, to me, you're not showing relevance. If I spend the time to pull everyone into a room and document everything we did and didn't do, and then that document just goes on to SharePoint, don't even do them, because the people in the room are going to know, okay, here we go again. James is going to talk to us for 3 hours for what? If you're not holding people accountable, and that shouldn't be a bad word, if you're not making changes to your point, policies and procedures and the organizations, then don't even do them. Give everyone their time back. Because like you said, you're not going to learn from the past. You're not going to improve. So just stop doing it.
Well, you mentioned an interesting word there, accountable. Accountable and responsible are not the same things. And I think a lot of people, when it comes to risk management, everybody's responsible to identify risks. And everyone's, depending on what the risk is, a lot of people are or need to be involved in mitigating that risk or addressing that risk. But there's only 1 or 2 that are actually accountable. And that's the person who the buck stops there.
Yeah.
It's that person. But a lot of people don't know who that is. When it comes to business continuity, the responsibility, accountability, everything, and you mentioned earlier, stays within one, that one person department.
Yeah.
And nobody else is responsible. Nobody else is accountable. But yet, you know, that governance, that hierarchy, that roles and responsibility has to be clearly defined, because everyone's responsible for risk. And there may only be one or two that are actually accountable. If something happens, they're losing their jobs.
Yeah, I was speaking to a company one time, their executive team, and the CEO asked me, well, who, trying to look at best practice, what should we be doing? Who's responsible for mitigating risk? And I said, you are. He said, what do you mean? I said, everyone in this room, this whole C-suite is responsible for mitigating risk. This is the only group of people who can put the time and money and resources to mitigate these risks. Your risk managers can elevate this to you. They can document it. They don't have any authority. They're not accountable. You're accountable.
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes we need to look at, like you said, those people who are accountable. It's not about getting people in trouble, but if you don't know who's accountable, how are you ever going to fix anything? Because they're the only people who can actually affect change in an organization.
Yeah, I've been part of programs where we identified the risks to what was going on, and we came up with our mitigation plan, but we were responsible to bring key risks, something that's really low. Alex will be on vacation on such and such a day. Well, who cares? Sure, it's a risk, but Alex being away isn't going to change anything, right? To Alex is the main implementer, and if he's not here on that day, then a higher risk that we get escalated to those who are accountable. We come up with the mitigation plan, we present it, here's our risk, and here's how we're going to address that risk. The accountable person can say, yes, that's a good plan, I agree with it, or can turn around and say, I'd rather you address it this way. Okay, great, we'll change it, and then you go forward. But a lot of times they don't want to hear it. We have a risk, we could lose $1 million. Okay, that one I'll pay attention to.
Exactly.
Like the bottom line gets the attention. But then that circles back to what you said at the beginning of this segment. We're looked at as an expense. Well, cut expenses, right?
Yeah, you can cut expenses, but then you're cutting revenue down the line. And I think that's another thing that people have realized the last 2 years, just that minimalist mentality. Companies are suffering top line and bottom line now because they didn't look at any of this, or because the people who look at things like this weren't good at articulating not just the risk, but the value. Like you said, it's very easy to tell a CEO, you're going to lose $1 million. And of course she's going to mitigate that risk. But how do you articulate value when it's not always a 7-figure issue?
Yeah, and to bring resilience back into this now with risk, that we're hearing and we're seeing it still happening, is the Great Resignation, where now organizations, the leadership, they've really got to take a harder look at their values and their missions, because people aren't leaving just because of COVID or they're forced to go back to the office. They're leaving because they don't feel valued anymore. They've looked at their values and say, hey, you know what? Pencil pushing every day is not what I want to contribute to society. So I want to move on. So organizations now need to look at that risk that, hey, there's a change in atmosphere out there now. We've got a risk we could lose some of our top people to go to other organizations or start their own businesses, which is what a lot of people are doing now. And I think, so risk isn't just, for me, not just what's happening within the organization, but now, and we've said this before, they've really got to look at the people aspects now of risk, because many organizations and lots of leadership for years have said, yeah, people are our greatest asset, people this, people that, wonderful. But nothing really ever happens. It's
Correct.
really just lip service. Now the workforce is stepping up and saying, no, you can't continue thinking like that. Not only are you responsible for the bottom line, you're responsible for the culture and for the retention of people and the getting the diversity and inclusion. If you're a leader, you've got to be a leader, which means you lead everything, not just the parts that make you look good. You've got to look at the parts that are tough to look at sometimes. And I think that's a risk that a lot of leadership is having struggles with right now, which is why people are leaving.
Exactly. And they also have the option to leave more so than they certainly have in my lifetime. But yeah, leaders are being held accountable, to your point, not just financially, but how are the people? How's the culture? And people, that's how you vote as an employee. Your vote is a yes vote is you stay, a no vote is you leave. And people are leaving. And I think it's great that people are being held accountable in all aspects, not just financially.
Yeah, and I see some of that, not some of that, but all of that as an extension to our risk management discussions. If you're on a risk committee, you can't just look at a report in front of you with numbers. You've got to look at the whole enterprise, what can impact us. It's not just your suppliers and et cetera, like the things that we mentioned before. It's also our people. How are our people feeling? How are they responding to what we're putting in place? Are we communicating the right way? There was an interesting, I think I read it in a book, which we'll get to later, but they were opening up a new restaurant in a predominantly Hispanic area, and they put all this work into it, but they ignored all the risks about communications, and they had the billboards up and everything was in Spanish, but they didn't look at everything properly. And when they opened the restaurant, nobody in the restaurant spoke Spanish, but they were in a Spanish area. It didn't work, obviously. So were the right people involved with that? Obviously not. Were they looking at the right set of risks? No, they weren't. They were just looking at the bottom line, get it open. There's a segment we can make money on. And that was their idea. But if they had taken into effect all the other aspects and all the different risks that could impact them, those people behind the counter would have spoken Spanish and they would have succeeded and those restaurants would be open.
Yeah, and I think company culture is an aspect of an organization that all too often risk managers and business continuity practitioners don't want to discuss or look at. But I can tell you right now, if your company has a poor culture, after a business continuity event, your absenteeism will be higher than your peers or other affected businesses. Absenteeism is always high after a disaster, a tornado, a hurricane, a mudslide, as it should be. People need to focus on their life safety, their family. But I can tell you, if you and I hate our company and our company has never cared about us, I'm not going to go the extra mile to come into work during a disaster or after a disaster. And I always talk to companies, that's where they get the most uncomfortable when we work through, the likelihood of business continuity and absenteeism. I always ask, what's your culture? And they're like, why? And I say, because if it sucks, your absenteeism is going to be much higher than even you think it is. And those are things that, we need to be thinking about as risk practitioners, as business continuity practitioners. What is the culture here?
Yeah, and that's when you also open up your brand, and your everyone in your organization to all those social media posts that start
Correct.
coming out. Alex Fullick Incorporated, they treated people terribly. They really didn't care. Even though they said the same things, they didn't walk the talk. Now that they've had this situation, well, here's something that they've done in the past. And then people will start posting their own experiences. And before you know it, you've got another crisis. And that's what causes it. It's your culture.
Correct.
People don't want to help you. I don't know if I've mentioned it to you, but years ago, there was a company in Waterloo, Ontario, just down the road from me. They had a massive winter storm, as we always do at some point around here. The office was open. People still many still got to the office. Some of them, it took 2 hours from what I was told. All the leadership, however, stayed home to work. And after 2.5, 3 hours of the office being open and people taking most of that morning just to try and get to the office, they turned around and said, oh, well, maybe we'll send everybody home because of the weather. Well, people were really peeved. And
They should be.
because of the culture, somebody turned around, called the local radio station, talk radio station, named the company, and said, this is what happened.
Yeah.
Well, did they ever have some work to do after that? Because they all of a sudden started getting other calls from people of the company. Yeah, this is what they did to me. This is what they did to me. And before you knew it, there you go. You've blown up. And what did you do? Leadership stayed home. You didn't have the good culture where people wanted to go that extra mile for you. Now it's different. I know the company and many of the people there. It's different now. But back then, no, it didn't work. They had to change.
Yeah, and I think you've certainly seen that with COVID-19 the last year and a half. Companies have shown their employees that they don't care and they shouldn't be trusted. And now people are leaving those companies. And to your point, if we worked in that company in Waterloo, the next time there was a storm, I'm not coming in no matter what any email, text, phone call, mass notification says, because I'm going to remember the last time. And so forget it. There's some ice on the roads, even any little bit. I'm looking for a reason now. I'll just stay home like you guys did.
Well, let's move on to, I think we've got maybe about 5-10 minutes left because I know we're going over, but that's okay. We always do anyway. So there was another report actually that, who was it that put it out?
Menlo Security.
Menlo Security, yes. 50% of companies in the survey will have people work from home, will still have people working from home. So what is the new business continuity strategy?
Yeah, you and I have talked about this, I think, all year. And I don't think a lot of companies are still thinking about this. If work from home was the old BC plan, what is the new BC plan? And I want to ask, are those types of plans even effective anymore? And I think this is where supply chain and vendor risk management is really going to come to the forefront of business continuity, whether people wanted to or not. I was speaking to someone this morning and they said, hey, I'm struggling because we use Slack for everything. And I asked IT, what happens if Slack goes down for a day or two? And IT said, that'll never happen, so don't worry about it. And this person said, well, that's a problem. And it does happen. Again, we keep hitting Facebook, but it's easy. Facebook's workspace and, Facebook and Instagram and all those other things were down a couple weeks ago for 24 hours. Companies I know that use Workspace as their communication platform were out of business for a day. And so I think if you haven't adjusted your thinking where now we're all working from home and you're still really focused on physical space, you have to shift your thinking around business continuity. It's not about us going to another office, but it is more so about tools. And in full transparency, you and I have had to reschedule 2 of our calls because we had internet struggles, and even with backups and alternates, we still weren't able to record our podcast. So maybe where's our BC plan is the right question to ask. But these companies and these practitioners still focused on the old getting back to where things were. This survey says half of these companies for the next 12 months are going to stay working from home. You can't not have business continuity plans or designs for 3 or 4 years.
Well, I've read a couple of articles that are starting to pop up here and there that some organizations now are looking at home offices as an extension of the main office.
Correct.
By identifying, where they are. They're requesting that if you can't have a home office, a room that you can close a door to, put it that way, and be in there alone, then you may have to go back to the office until you can establish that. If you're working from your dining room table, or your kitchen, or something like that, well, that can't be considered a home office, and they don't want you to do that anymore because the privacy and security and things like that. So some places are starting to look at it that way. If you're in the home office, well, then maybe we can now start looking at things. Okay, here's and looking at some of the other topics like not working extended hours. You close your office door, you leave there, and they're starting to try and think of some policies around that because it's now a closed environment, and they can consider that part of the office, so that if you're getting yourself a coffee or a tea, if you're outside of that room, it's no longer workers' compensation. If you trip and fall over the cables of your computer, well, then that's workers' compensation. So, and those are just ideas that some companies are starting to float around. There was even one comment about potentially seeing a resurgence in the off-site vendors, that used to have, 200 available seats. And somebody, but I'm not sure about that myself, because I was never a really big fan of it anyway. Because if you had a wide scale disaster and 200 seats, well, all these big companies contract how many, companies that sign up for those 200 seats. You'd have to be the fastest phone dialer in the world, to secure them. So you can pay for all that money and never ever use it. So I'm not a big fan of those ones. Some others said that what they might do is, if they have 5 floors in an office tower, if everyone's working from home, they're only going to pay the rent for 2 now and use that as their backup site if somebody's home office goes down, and have it kind of as a hoteling station, so that it's fluid. But of course, you still have to look at all the social distancing and all those other aspects. So those are some of the ideas that I've been seeing out there. I'd be interested to see how things eventually come to pass with that, so that they can then put proper continuity in place. If you lose your home office, well, you can sign up and get a hotel station in the main building, so you can still work that way. If the main building goes down, well, then you're working at home anyway. So there you go. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out over the coming years.
Yeah, and I think some of those policies are going to destroy or erode company culture, and companies aren't even thinking about it. So the example of you have to have a room with a door that closes means you have to have dedicated space in your personal home that you aren't using. And that is a very troubling issue for me from an inclusion standpoint, because that means you're not entry level. When I started out in the workforce, I did not have an extra room to just hang out and work. So if COVID-19 would have happened 25 years ago, I would have been the guy working in my living room, at my kitchen table, in the bathroom floor, wherever. And so I think it'll be interesting. The companies who make those types of decisions are really making financial decisions that they're implicitly saying, if your income with us is above X, you can work from home. And if it's below that, you can't work from home. Or if you're in a densely populated area, if you and I lived in New York City, we would not have the square footage that we have now. Yeah. And I think some of these companies are going to make decisions around that based on risk, and totally not be inclusive, because they're not thinking that a lot of those decisions personally are driven by disposable income.
Yeah, and what do you do with people that are, well, like New York, living in bachelor apartments? We've been on calls, where you can see the person's bed, made up behind them, because the only spot they've got is in their bedroom. So how can you designate someone's bedroom office space?
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense. I know I wouldn't tolerate that. I was like, no. I think that's pushing it a little far, I think,
Exactly.
So, well, we've come to the end of the show, James. Any final comments on risk or BCI or anything right now?
I want to thank Luke for providing a topic, and I would love anyone who's still listening to us watching at this point. Alex and I are always happy to tackle almost any topic. So if you have some ideas or things you'd like to see us talk about, please send them in.
Yeah, I second that. Feel free. Send James a note or myself a note, either way. And we are always touch base before we record anyway, so we can always bring up topics and say what we want to say here, or maybe who knows, maybe bring a guest on at some point, who wants to join in on a conversation. You never know. Thanks, James. Always good to talk to you, even though it's been 5 days in a row or something like that. You'll probably be sick of seeing me for a while. But I know we'll talk again next week. I'm sure lots will happen in the meantime. But thanks again for sharing your time and expertise. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex.
And to everyone watching, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.